Anyone who seriously reads the Gospels realizes that Jesus drew people to Him through patience and love, never by force. This way of love has to be a slow process, demanding much patience and perseverance. I think today's Gospel, as familiar as it is with us, might be called the parable of patience. First of all, I think it's good to remember that in this story, in this reading, Jesus is not talking to His enemies, He's talking to His friends. The bad guys in this story are really good people, Christ's own followers. You know, it's a strange thing about impatience. It sometimes makes good people do very rash or bad things. And I think the story is simple enough, as are all of Jesus' parables. A man goes out to sow seed in a field, and while he is asleep, his enemy comes and puts weeds down. At the time of Jesus, this story was a familiar one, because in Palestine, in ancient Palestine, if someone held a grudge against another man, they oftentimes did this very thing. In fact, Roman law had a prescription against this. There was a penalty for being caught doing this. It was a dirty trick. The species of weed that was used was called darnel wheat. And when it's planted and growing, it is impossible to tell the wheat from the weeds. It's only when it matures and comes to full ear that an expert can tell one from the other. And of course, by then it's too late. The wheat is damaged. Weeds and wheat. It's a story of the good and bad in all of us. In us, in our neighborhoods, in our families, in our nation, and among nations. Good and bad exists together, growing out of the same soil, nurtured and drawing energy from the same sun, watered by the same rain, moving in the same wind, and putting down roots tenaciously as it holds on to life. In ourselves, in our families, in our church, in a world, in all of us, there is a mixed field of weeds and wheat. There is caring, there's also selfishness. There's resolution as well as despair. There's acceptance as well as jealousy. There's cooperative love as well as callous manipulation of each other. The good and the bad growing up together in all of us. Returning to the story, we find that the servants notice what is happening to the wheat field. They recognize the weeds and they don't like them. They want to do something about them. These farmhands in the story, remember, represent us, the good people. People who belong to Christ and care about what's happening in His kingdom. They see the weeds and their impulsive reaction is twofold. First, they're impatient with the imperfection that they find in this field. And secondly, they're very angry with the Master for allowing it to happen. Lord, didn't you sow good seed in this field? How can you let this happen? How can you let the bad grow alongside with the good unpunished? What's the matter with you, God? Didn't you put the world together correctly? The farmhands ask permission from the Master to root out the weeds. As self-appointed experts, they feel they can tell the bad from the good. They know the weeds and they know the wheat. They only ask permission to go out and do something. They want the right to judge because, you see, they can see very clearly what's wrong with God's world. They are truly us, aren't they? As we grow up and become mature, we see the sins and the selfishness that are cropping up in our own lives and in our families and certainly in society. And these things become unbearable to us. We are impatient. We want to do something. I thought by this time in my life I would be a better person. Sin is still an obstacle to me. What's wrong with me? Or I had hoped so strongly that my children by now would have grown up to be what I wanted them to be. because you see, I know best. Or I had expected the church to be made up of all saints. Or fellow workers would all be fair. People would live up to their promises, and that love would sway the world. But these things aren't true, and I'm angry about it, and I want to do something about it. And I'm going to do something. I'll nag my family, and I'll keep nagging them until they do the right thing, the thing I know that they should do, because you see, I know what's best for them. I'll nag them even if I have to drive every bit of life and happiness and joy from their lives. And I'll retaliate against those who do me wrong, because obviously these people are doing it to me out of spite. It's never an accident. It's an accident if I do it to you. The church isn't meeting my expectations. I'll leave it and do something else. I have all the right answers to the world's problems. Oh Lord, just allow me to judge. Let me go out there and begin pulling up the weeds. But in Jesus' story, the Master says, oh no. You have no permission to indulge yourself in any kind of destruction on the wheat fields of my world. Let both the weeds and the wheat grow together, and then I will judge. I will separate the weeds from the wheat. Your job is not to weed out or to destroy or to judge. Your job is to make things grow. Now, this doesn't mean that we should sit on our hands throughout life and never do anything. But I think it does mean that in our families, as parents, in the workplace, in society, any actions that we perform to try and right what's wrong with the world or with ourselves must never leave the situation worse than when we arrived. We must always be a solution and not become part of a problem. Besides, the Lord might continue, you can't tell from your vantage point which are weeds and which are wheat. Look at your own past. Look at your life. Wasn't it perhaps that miserable year, perhaps even in high school, when you felt worthless, drifting and alone? Now, in retrospect, you look back at that time of your life and realize how valuable it was? Didn't all of us at one time or another have to go through the darkness and the despair and the fright in order to come to some kind of understanding about what life is all about? And yet your parents and your friends and perhaps even yourself at that time looked at you and said, weeds. What are we going to do with our restless son? Why is my daughter so unhappy? Why can't I get it all together? What's wrong with me? Remember those questions? And now we look back and see that this was a time of real growth of wheat. It was a period of life that we're glad we've had, because it was then that we developed self-assurance through trial. It was then that by sinning and having to know and beg forgiveness that we learned to become compassionate ourselves, so that when our children come along and make the same mistakes that we did, we can say, hey, I've been there, I understand. At some time in our life, when we thought we had lost God, and then discovered surprisingly that we had found Him again. I think this is a comforting gospel, comforting for all of us, because it points out that God is much more merciful than any of us are, and thank God for that. And He is even much more merciful than we can imagine He is. He is truly a Father. Becoming mature means coming to grips with the realization that this world is not here and running at our convenience and our good pleasure. Yes, there's a lot wrong with the world and with ourselves, but with patience, everything can work out. And maturity comes from taking responsibility, too, for our hurts and our imperfections, the ones we inflict on ourselves and on others. And if we're determined to learn from them, we can grow and allow others to grow. You see, we cannot really distinguish the weeds from the wheat. All we can do, all any of us can do, is to try and strive to keep the soil healthy and give the wheat a chance. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen.